Alexandra is here with me, and she's Be Strong Families and from Richmond. But just introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and where you're joining from. And this is Be Strong Families webinar series, Staying Strong and Positive for Ourselves and Our Children. We've been going at this to the end of week 48. Hi, Morgan from Sheboygan. Hi, Elvia. Nice to see you from Illinois. Hi, Elvia. We're going to be getting started in about 30 seconds. And hi, Jennifer from Sonoma County.
Hi, Jennifer.
Shout out to Jennifer. Andrew, Be Strong Families, wonderful, from Minnesota. Hi, Danielle from San Francisco.
Hi, Tammy.
Lilith, Pennsylvania. Hi, Lindsay from Chicago. And it's 12 o'clock, so we're going to get started because we have a really wonderful, I think we have a very exciting and wonderful webinar planned for you today. Alex and I have worked on it, and we're really, I think I speak for both of us when I say that we feel like this information is so important.
Definitely.
And so relevant and so timely. And we had a really great time putting it together. It's almost cathartic to put it together, right?
Yeah, it really is. It really is. The sharing, the learning, the revelations, all of it.
And our topic in celebration of Black History Month is framing the narrative of Black history. So we welcome you all. And just some housekeeping before we get started. Just want to remind you about the ways to engage. We have some times when we're going to be asking questions in this webinar, and we want you to be able to weigh in and answer. And the primary way that people usually do this on our webinar series is through the chat. So the chat is always open to you, and you are totally welcome to put anything you want in the chat at any time, subject to the agreements that are going to come next, which Elvia has already agreed to. But I also want to put out there that if you want to talk, if you want to be heard, if you have something that you want to say, you can raise your hand. Selena, who is with us behind the scenes, making sure everything goes smoothly, will unmute you, and then you'll need to unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to talk. So with that, just going to go into the fact that whenever Be Strong Families does anything, we have agreements, and this is in recognition that we co-create this safe space together for all of us to learn and grow. So these are our agreements for today, which are pretty basic. If you agree to these agreements, especially being here now, and again, we sometimes put this last one on, we put it on when we think that the information that we're sharing might be triggering, or might have a particular resonance that would require stepping away for a minute. So it kind of counted the, please no multitasking, but if you need a minute, take a minute and come back. If everybody agrees to the agreements, we're going to get started. 1 second, I have to have a sip.
I think I need one too. We've been talking all morning.
It's also just, I didn't want to cough, but I coughed anyway. So when we reframe the narrative of Black history, we have to start out from a place of asking the question, what is history? And I was introduced to this E.H. Carr, who's a historian. He's now not alive anymore, but he was a historian, a diplomat, a journalist. He wrote a 14-volume history of the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1929. And he wrote a really important book, which is called What is History?, which was published way back in 1961. I was born around that time, so it wasn't, I didn't learn about this What is History until like 20 years later. But it was really important because before E.H. Carr, history was understood to just be the facts. He was the first person who basically said, no, history is not just the facts. Now we're very familiar with that idea. History, historical facts, the historians who are writing history choose the facts that they're going to put into the record. And that choice is important because history is what happened. Historiography is the story that's told about it, about what happened. And that's different because people have different points of view on history. There's also, and this is really important for us now today when we get into like current events and the stories that are being told about it, which is the whole idea of rhetoric versus reality. So there's history and historiography, which means there's what's happened and the story that's told about what's happened. And there's also the opportunity to kind of bend and twist things to be able to support your point of view. And he pointed out that that was something that could happen in the guise of history, that someone could be, so basically propaganda, is rhetoric versus reality, or what people's reality is not the same as rhetoric. And then finally, to me, the other key point that he had with this What is History book is the perspective of the person who's writing the history. So history is, if you take a war, for example, history has often written from the point of view of the victor of the war. The one who won gets to tell the story. And the point of view of the people that lost in the war is kind of submerged. It doesn't make the dominant narrative. And that means when we get to this, even this word history, I started seeing it as his story. Whose story? Like kind of like the man, the one who won, gets to write the story. And so if we live in a country or in a culture that's dominated by white men, those are the people whose story you're going to find most in history books. And I don't say this. This isn't just me. This is what this historian, British historian, I believe, in 1961 kind of broke open the field of history by making these claims. So he encouraged everyone to think about whose story is being told as a result of in history. And since that time, like since 1961, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, thousands, we've been on this long journey, or we've been in this mode where we really are kind of more aware of whose history is this that we're telling. So that's our little introduction. Did anybody have any questions about? I know that's kind of dense because we launched right into the philosophy, right into the meta level. But Alex, did I do okay on?
I think it was perfect. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I think let's go. And so, Black History Month. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, he was one of the first scholars to study and write about people in America of African descent, as well as the entire diaspora. He created what was Negro History Week in 1926, was for the second week in February. He did this intentionally because it aligned with Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And so it took up from 1926 to 1970, where some African-American educators and some of the students at Kent State University expanded this week, took the Negro off, expanded this week to be Black History Month. And then from there, which was still good, 1976, 6 years later, it was President Ford that included it as official celebration into the American calendar. So when you look at that range from 1926 to 1976, for this to be a part of the dominant history narrative to be celebrated, that in of itself speaks to exactly what Katthe was talking about. Like, how do you reframe? How do you get this different voice? And then there's this great article that Katthe found that actually came out this morning in the New York Times. Selena's going to put it in the chat, that actually talks a little bit more in depth about this history and then why it is extremely important now, especially with the dialogue that's happening around equity, diversity, and inclusion that's happened all over the country in various organizations. So please, when you get a chance, take some time and read that article. It's a great article. Next slide. And so Carter G. Woodson, he was the author of several books and scholarly journals, etc. But this quote came from the miseducation of the Negro, which really sums up why it is important for the narrative of history in general to be reframed, American history, and then for African Americans to have, and people of the African descent in general, have their perspective, their research, and their narrative injected into the dominant history narrative. So he says no systematic effort towards change has been possible for or taught the same economics, history, philosophy, literature, and religion, which have established the present code of morals. The Negro's mind has been brought under the control of his oppressor. The problem holding the Negro down, therefore, is easily solved. When you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. You don't have to tell him to stand here or yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no door, he will cut a door on for his special benefit. His education makes this necessary. And so one of the things why Black history is so important and what he's saying is the programming that's happened, particularly for people of African descent, but just American society, because Black history has not been included in the dominant narrative of history in the discipline. Next slide, please.
So I think the key of this, when we say the spectrum of Black history is encapsulated in American history as repetitive highlights, what we're saying is that it's not that there's nothing about Black history in the history books or in what children are taught in school. It's just the same figures, the same people, the same events, the same stories are told again and again. And it isn't a full picture, and it is in some ways a biased picture. But so this is what we put out in here as questions to you in the chat, or if somebody wants to raise their hand and speak to it. What is taught in schools, and how does it contribute to stereotypes about African Americans, and how does it impact the self-concept of African Americans, particularly children and youth? And Alex, did you want to just have those questions in our mind as we went forward, or do you want to actually answer them?
I think if someone may want to answer it, and we were really strategic. I just want to add, we were strategic about this graphic because with the Black chemists, because a lot of the contributions, like Black chemists and Black astrophysicists, we don't hear about that. And they're not just present day, they go all the way back to the inventors, etc. So I don't see anyone in the chat and no one's raised their hand, but just think about this as we move along, as Katthe said.
Well, so, maybe we could ask a different question, which is, when you think about what is taught in schools or what people learn in history in elementary school or junior high or high school, what are the highlights? What are the highlights of African American history? Come on, brave souls, put it in the chat.
We're waiting on you.
What are highlights? Slaves were freed. Yes, there was slavery, slaves were freed. Yes, civil war. Maybe the civil rights movement, right? And Dr. Martin Luther King, right?
We're taught the same handful of people every year. Definitely, yep, Lindsay.
Tubman, not to take anything away from those people, but it's the same ones every time.
Miss Jennifer Johnson would like to speak.
Okay, and Tamara said she grew up in Catholic school and they really didn't teach much history at all, let alone Black history. I think we got more religious history than anything else.
Okay, should we let Jennifer speak?
Yeah, hi, Jennifer.
Hey, ladies and everybody. Sorry, I'm just having a hard time typing fast. I kind of want to reiterate the same kind of few people are taught, but also like the white men who were in charge that did, you know, like Abraham Lincoln. So sometimes it's framed, it's not even like celebrating those same few people. It's like really glorifying what the white people did with abolitionism.
I think that's such an excellent, excellent point, Jennifer. Thank you for bringing that up. right? It's like it jumps like, oh, Abraham Lincoln, he was great. But not all of the movements, the people, the sacrifices it took to get to that point. Definitely a great point.
I think there, and I think there's other, that particularly goes to how does it impact the self-concept of African Americans, particularly children and youth? Because if you learned that you were kind of the pawns in the story, you weren't the actors. You know, the actors were the abolitionists or the white people who were helping. You know, that you were helped. You were the helped. You know, then and you were the help. There's a movie, the great movie on that also. But then that impacts what you think you're capable of. I mean, and silencing, not having the full range of contributions that African Americans have made limits the possibilities that children and youth think of for themselves, which is why it's important to have a woman of color as vice president. You know, it's important to have a black president. Doesn't mean racism is gone, but it's important to have black doctors, you know, and have your children see black doctors, your children see black lawyers, your children see black academics, you know, because then it like, I can be that because she's that, you know.
Yeah, representation definitely matters. Even like we know that through the media and through entertainment, as far as what we see on TV and movies.
Stephen Borrow raised his hand.
Hi, Stephen.
Howdy, y'all. I just wanted to make a quick comment. So responding to someone that mentioned it, I want to be very clear that I'm not picking on this individual who said we were taught that the slaves were freed. But I think this is a very important point because this is exactly what our school system teaches. But that's passive voice, right? The slaves were freed. Okay, so who is doing the freeing of the slaves? And it discredits the work that African Americans did towards achieving their own emancipation. And that passive versus active voice is a very important historical conversation.
Thank you, Stephen.
Right.
That's Be Strong's own Stephen.
Yeah, Be Strong. Andrew also is the Be Strong family's person. He says, to me, the highlights always seem to be about slavery. That was all I was ever taught. And in retrospect, there was a huge emphasis on slaves being freed by the North, but a lack of education around the role Black people played in their own liberation through outlets like joining the army and the resilience of Black people to fight for their rights during Reconstruction in the face of waning federal involvement after the Civil War. So I think he's, you know, re-emphasizing what everybody's saying, which is the narrative is very partial. And even like if you read about the Harlem Renaissance or you read about jazz in New Orleans, like I want to say that there are other places where African Americans come into the picture, you know, but you know, into the whole, you know, panorama of American life, but also as entertainers, as musicians, which isn't bad. It's like it's part of it, but it's a narrow view, which is what we're going to get to as we
Yeah. I want to add one thing. And so like everybody's heard, especially recently, you know, there was a movie made about it not too long ago, and then in the political climate, right, about Black Wall Street. And everybody thinks it's just in Tulsa. There was Black Wall Streets in a lot of different cities. There were also what was like Richmond, where I'm from, was considered the Harlem of the South because it was a capital for Black music and artists having their own venues, etc. And then the one last point is because I did grow up in Virginia, every year we had to go to Jamestown. And up until recently, the way it was portrayed, you have the live actors of those who haven't been to Jamestown. They like put on a whole presentation because they preserved some of the space, and everybody was happy. And I remember when I was a little girl, before I started putting together, I was like, but they're enslaved. Like, why are they happy? So just that's another framing, is like as if, you know, we were content to be enslaved. So next slide.
Lindsay makes a point, you know, as we're moving on, that we're also taught, maybe not directly, but definitely indirectly, that basically everyone loved these Black leaders at the time. So that, like, you know, Harriet Tubman or even Martin Luther King Jr., you know, that everybody loved these Black leaders at the time. And in my opinion, it makes white people feel like we would have been on the right side of history had we lived at that time. That reminds me of, like, you know, in Jewish Holocaust, like the emphasis is on the righteous Gentiles who hid the Jews, you know, like, and there's nothing about Jewish resistance in the camps or in the ghetto. It just doesn't exist, as a narrative,
Hmm. I think that's an extremely important point. This next kind of section, we've decided to call Hidden Figures and Contributions, kind of riffing off of the movie Hidden Figures, which is a very wonderful story, right? So you have Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and Katherine Johnson was from Hampton, Virginia, I might add. And what they accomplished in order for the space program to be what it is today and to assist with America landing on the moon, etc. Now, what we did right here, this is our wall. It is not inclusive. It is our wall of people who are not highlighted. There are chemists on this wall. There are astrophysicists on this wall. There are sociologists on this wall. There are poets. There are activists. There's the first transgender activist on this wall. And so I would encourage everyone, they are writers. I would encourage everyone to when we have the recording to just take the time and go back and just put it in your Google search and read some of these stories. They are like fascinating. Actually, I learned there was some people that I learned about that I didn't know, and I'm a super student of African and African history just in the process of putting this together. So this is our wall of people that never get their chance in the narrative, who did incredible things.
And it's also something you could do with kids too. Like it's also something that kids and families could do together, is just, find hidden figures, like
Exactly. Next step. And it was funny when I was doing this, Katthe, to that point, one of the twins came in and she was like, oh, we learned about this person. Oh, I learned about this person. Like she had identified like two people. So hidden figures and contributions. There's the contributions that we kind of hit on this that are always highlighted: certain sports, specific arts, entertainment and pop culture, fashion, civil rights, right? Even in civil rights, you don't even talk about the Black liberation movement that is happening simultaneously that's different from civil rights, and that's not just the Panthers. There's like the Black Liberation Army. There are other, CORE and SNCC. They were all a little bit more about liberation. And so that
and
never
they get
gets highlighted.
vilified too. And that's the other point, is like the Panthers get vilified, like they're dangerous, Malcolm X is dangerous,
Yep.
Martin Luther King is the hero,
Right.
So,
And it's a safe version of him too. Like if you actually read his writings, the version that they portray of Martin Luther King is not even of the entirety of who he is. But just like on this wall, we've made contributions to American history and culture in science, philosophy, psychology, education, civil engagement, law, judicial system. There was one of those names was the first African American judge, the first lawyer to present over to the Supreme Court. There was also this social worker who was like actually a part of taking down Lucky Luciano, and she assisted with the DA's office, but it was her forework. So fascinating stuff. Next slide, please. Few little did you knows, and you see this picture on the left. So Matthew Henson, you can Google him. He was a part of one of the first successful expeditions to the North Pole, and then he made 7 separate voyages on his own with his own team. Octavia Butler, who is just one of my favorites. She is one of the most notable and kind of like the first Black sci-fi author. She's also birthed this whole Afrofuture movement. And she was the first science fiction writer, period, right? Not Black, period, to receive a MacArthur Fellowship. She has great books. I mean, I love all of them. And she had this 40-year career, and then she accomplished this, and she had dyslexia, a mild case of dyslexia as a child. And then this picture to the right, I just love this because I love highlighting women, and particularly Black women. This is the battalion that was established to deliver to American troops and government personnel and volunteers, and they were in England. And they actually, before they went there, they did all of this training, like how to maneuver through stuff, because they would actually deliver in the war zone. So they had close calls, injuries, and some of the women died. But they were an entire African American battalion. Next slide. So Ida B. Wells, sometimes she gets mentioned, but it doesn't come from this perspective, which is she wrote, right, the Southern Horrors, the pamphlet, the Southern Horrors, and it exposed, and she was one of the people that I think, like where everybody was saying, like, who wrote these articles that was a part of the abolitionist movement to expose what was happening, right, and even later on after the enslavement of African people. But she is the first one to do what's called the investigative journalism. She created the framework. It was not like that before, which we've seen now has changed all types of, situations and made people aware of things that's going on in the entire world. Valerie Thomas, so that's her on the side. It was a wonderful learning about her. She created the technology that is the basis for modern 3D television, video games, and movies. And then, we've seen this list before, but I think it's worth mentioning. Sometimes people don't know. And it is an exhaustive list. This doesn't even touch on it. But the clock, the lawnmower, the cell phone, the refrigerated trucks, that was one I did not know myself. So without the invention who created that, we wouldn't have fresh vegetables. There would be no transportation for us to have fresh vegetables and fruit at our grocery stores. There's another one. The first design of the home security system was created by an African-American woman. Automated elevator doors, the central heating furnace design, the street sweeper, especially for those of you like Katthe in those big cities in New York, it would be super dirty if there was no street sweeper, and countless other.
The truck, this with the, wow.
Yep. So just again, like it's worth the Google to see, all of the things that African Americans contribute to things that make our life easier right now. Next slide, please.
So the main point of this particular webinar is reframing the narrative. So how do we tell the story? How do we recognize that the stories that are told from a particular point of view? And how do we tell the story from a different perspective? And what we're going to do going forward is kind of take some incidents, like we're going to talk about situations. We're going to talk about the continent of Africa. We're going to talk about just and kind of like create an opposition between what might be a dominant or mainstream narrative that you might have learned in school or you might be picking up in the news, and another way of looking at it. So that's where we're going now. So I will do this one because I have, please just make all the text come up, Selena, because I'm not going to do each one individually. But the whole point here is, like, I was an anthropologist. I studied anthropology in college, and I studied anthropology because I was interested in alternative points of view on history, basically. It was my initially thinking, I wonder what other people, I wonder what they think or how they look at things differently from the way I'm being taught. And there was this concept in anthropology back in the day, which has been eclipsed by the subaltern, like by activists who have asked anthropologists to have recognized how biased the narrative of anthropology is. So anthropologists used to talk about primitive tribes. Now it's indigenous people, and that's as a result of their activism to say, who are you calling this primitive? It's got a negative connotation. But primitive was kind of, it's really hard to kind of completely root out all of the nuances and valences of this history of thinking of things as primitive versus civilized. So, the narrative of primitive, and then, colonialism happens and white people go all over the world and save the day, right? So
civilize everyone.
And Africa is in this story, which is part of history, Africa is looked at as the dark continent. And we even heard our previous president, how did he refer to African nations? Now, naked natives, you see the National Geographic, like naked natives is still in the mindset of a lot of people in terms of who haven't been to Africa, about what goes on in Africa, because what tribal violence, the savages, and no real contributions to civilization. That's like a picture. And I'm telling you, 20 years ago, Bank Street educated early childhood teacher in my son's first grade. My son is Ethiopian American, and he had just come to this country when he was 8 years old, and he was in first grade. And she, trying to be very like complimentary of him, said to me, "Isn't it amazing how they can go from swinging on trees to being in a classroom in just a short amount of time?" And I looked at her and I was like, "Have you ever been to Ethiopia?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, I assure you that they are not swinging from trees. There are cities in Africa. There is, I was trying to, but to me, to bridge that gap, and I want to say this was a well-meaning, well-educated woman. So I don't think we can say that this idea of Africa is totally in the past. It still shows up in people's biases because of lack of exposure. When in reality, and do you want to do this part, or do you want me to do this part?
No, keep going. I'll jump in.
When in reality, the story of Africa and what was going on in Africa for millennia, like for years and years and years, is the story of innovation, invention, technology. We don't even know how sophisticated some of the wonders of the world are unknowns to us. How were the pyramids built? Like, how could the pyramids be built, if they didn't have access to all modern 20th century technology? Well, they had to know something, and there's a lot of what went on in African history that we don't know, but we assume that it wasn't very impressive, when in fact, there are ancient kingdoms and empires, and these are just a few of them, that really were very sophisticated social systems, and made great contributions to what we do now in terms of medicine and navigation, architecture and engineering, metalworking, math, astronomy. Like, there were major contributions.
And I want to add one thing, Katthe. So like that, that whole thing about the naked tribes, right? And what goes into that mentality is, one, there's also, like you talked about, the projection, right? But it's also this idea that the people who choose to still live in nature and not in the city, right? Which, one, I always like it to, like, if you showed the poverty in West Virginia and said, "This is America," that would be the perception, right? And not even saying that the people who are choosing to live with nature, getting to my second point, aren't intelligent, don't have sophisticated systems. They just choose not to be in the city, empire, kingdom systems. And a great example of that is the Dogon, who have, for thousands of years, they had mapped out the planets, the stars, etc. But at a glance, right, Katthe, from anthropology, they would fall into this naked natives until you start having conversations and real, like, the sophistication of their understanding of the planet, of energy fields, of the stars, and how things line up. So I just wanted to add that.
And it's a lot of things. When you add that, Alexandra, it also, this is my particular jam, which is, there has been kind of, in science, they made certain rules about what counted as reality in science, okay? And it screened out a lot of human experiences and a lot of human knowledge by virtue of saying it has to be empirically by the senses. So the thing is, science tends to not believe that something is real unless they can demonstrate how it was discovered or known through their methods. So when the Dogon talk about like things that we haven't discovered yet or we don't know yet, we just dismiss it. We being, the scientific establishment, we just dismiss it. And what's happening is in science, like with complex dynamic, complex systems theory and nonlinear dynamic systems theory, is that we are bridging that gap between so-called science and so-called spirituality, but we're becoming more aware of things that we just hadn't mapped. Another example of this, and you can Google it, anybody, is in acupuncture, they talk about meridians in the body, right? And that these are, according to Western science, imaginary, right? They're energy fields. Well, it's only in the last few years that we've discovered the fascia network, and that there's a whole network of empty space through the body, through the physical body, that we didn't map because we weren't looking for empty space. We were looking for organs and we were looking for blood vessels. We weren't looking at the negative space. And it turns out that negative space is really important, but it's kind of unknown to Western medicine, but it was known to Eastern medicine. And the same thing happens with the knowledge, the very sophisticated knowledge that some of the African kingdoms and African tribes, had.
Very interesting. Like, so the other thing that happens in history is the dismissing the oral storytelling and how information is passed down. But then on the flip side of that, African nations were the first one to invent paper. So then you have, you have writing, etc. Someone has something in the chat.
Well, Ramona says American history doesn't tell the world's history. American history only says African Americans started off enslaved. There's no background on how there were kings and queens, or how one of the African tribes almost overthrew the Roman government. Well, I know in Ethiopia, because I know something about the history of Ethiopia, the Italians tried to colonize Ethiopia and they were unsuccessful. So and Ethiopians are very proud of that they staved off colonization. And in Ethiopia, they have a whole different time. It's a different time and date there than it is anywhere else in the world. But yeah, they resisted and successfully resisted colonization in Ethiopia. So Ramon says, educate yourself with other cultures and their history. The more we know about other cultures, the more we learn about ourselves.
Definitely.
Cool. And Lindsay says, in my own experience, westernized white Christian churches have a role in how we view places like Africa as well, right? The view is pushed that these are impoverished areas that need our help and need saving. And that's a whole nother discussion. We're going to get a little bit more into that, which is, with missionization, that's kind of like what savages, let's get into this slaves versus enslaved now.
So words matter, right? This is a quote from a writer, and also she has her PhD, I believe, also in history. She said, when you use the language of slave or slavery, it just is. It is just a fact. When you say a slave, that is who the person is, right? But when you say enslaved, you recognize that there was a process that took place, and you're also recognizing, as she says, that something was done to them, right? It's a condition, it's a moment in time, it's temporary. Whereas slave, there's no end in sight. And so for me, it's about the temporality, oh God, I'm messing it up, of the term of enslaved or enslavement, so that we understand that it was a moment and a condition that we could get freed from. And so the next slide. So here we have it, right? And I think, she has a lot of information in this chat, who's ever typing that, right? So they were savages needing to be saved. They were lucky, right? That's kind of like what that's what that teacher was telling your son. Oh, you're lucky to be here. Your property, you're docile, you to be controlled, inferior, uncivilized, weak. All of those things that's been the narrative about people of African descent who were enslaved. And like, as I shared last Friday, the people who were enslaved, and just the pure horror and how many people, the reason why so many people are in so many places, especially like Brazil, that has the highest number of people of African descent outside of Africa. One, because of the sugar cane. So it was so bad that slaves, like enslaved people, kept dying like every 2 years, 3 years. But even in totally the process, you had to bring so many enslaved people to even to be able to survive, to make it here alive. So the people that are here are the strongest of the strong, right? We're survivors. And so we were, the enslaved is like, it tells you like, oh, we're treated as property, right? Deprived of inhumanity. It actually makes it clear that this was an injustice, that this is something that is wrong. There's the history of resistance. And I think somebody brought this up. It's like, it's not just Harriet Tubman. It's not just Nat Turner's Rebellion. It's not just it's just not the Haitian Revolution. It is the subtle ways that Black people resisted too over time to ensure that I would be here, right? The different systems of communication through songs, through the drumming, etc. Resilience. I think resilience is like a Black person's superpower, because it's like been like, passed down. Extreme ingenuity and creativity. I think that also came when you see that show up, in the arts and how we contribute to the arts in this country. Strong family and relational kinship. We talked about that last week when people wanted to try to go find their families at the end of their enslavement. And if they couldn't, they just formed new families. Focused, determined, courageous, patient. That patient goes back into those other subtle ways that people of African descent resisted. And then looking at it this way, it's like liberation becomes a part of the narrative. And then I wanted to just highlight a little bit, there's also this narrative that with the whole savages and uncivilized, that there was nothing brought here, right? That they had to learn how to speak English and learn the religion of Jesus and all of this stuff, right? But as Katthe talked about in the previous slide, they brought their spiritual practices, their cosmology, their theology, their philosophy. They brought all of their skill sets like wood carving and basket weaving, art, music, storytelling. And then they brought this communal and collective mindset. And then I really wanted to highlight, and some of it surprised me, that they brought not also the understanding of agricultural practices, but these actual things that people now think are a part of the American food. And then I want to highlight the cola nut, right? So the cola nut is something that's very high in caffeine. Do you know what the cola nut creates? Coca-Cola and Pepsi. There would be no Coca-Cola and Pepsi if the enslaved people of African descent did not bring the cola nut with them. And then again, so the weaving, making fabric, etc. So do you have anything in the chat?
No, Andrew was just talking about Hollywood, and the way that we want to have a feel-good version of historical figures and events, and I think some of my education about slave versus enslaved happened at the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, which there have always been, like you're talking about Jamestown, like there have always been, like you go on vacation to the South and you can visit the plantations, but most of the plantations were steeped in this sanitized, whitewashed version of what it was to be a slave. The Whitney Plantation was consciously created to be able to tell the true story or more of the facts about what happened during slavery, so that there's, just to really have people understand it as an economic system, and that, that part of like the runaway slave, it was like the equivalent of a house moving, a $300,000 house, like getting up on 2 feet and going away. So the pursuit wasn't just a pursuit of this, this person or this possession. It was a person. It was also economic. Like there was a huge economic incentive. And I just also want to point out, and this comes from my anthropological and historical education, which is it's intentional to view the slave this way or to say slave and to view the slave this way. If you look at the history of Native Americans in this country or American Indians, the way they're described changes in the legal documents depending on what the people in charge want to do to them. So they're savages that need saving if you want to, depending on what you want to do with them. You know, they're inhuman animals depending on what you want to do with them, you know. So I think to justify whatever it is that the people in charge, whatever they want to perpetrate, you know.
Yeah, and I think especially what you said about the horrors of slavery. You know, we've had a few mutant movies and people are like, right? But like that when you view it as slavery versus enslavement, what you don't get and see is that this is an African Holocaust, which is called the Ma'afa, and it's celebrated. You can look that up. Like this is really a Holocaust. There's anywhere, and they haven't agreed, 20 to 40, some say 100 million people died just in the Middle Passage, just getting here, right? And then there was another process once you got here that you had to break because they weren't docile, right? These were like strong people who knew their heart, their culture, they had the spiritual practice of breaking their humanity. So just wanted to add that on to what you were saying, Katthe.
Genocide. I mean, it's genocide, and it's not.
Yep.
Slavery isn't referred to in the history books as genocide. You know, and there are genocides that are referred to as genocide. I mean, so I think it's an important point. And I would just like to speak of, you know, the spiritual practices. These spiritual practices are extremely powerful technologies that got people through this horrific experience.
Definitely.
So, and sometimes we tend to look at African spirituality as somehow a less evolved form or something, or that it's not, you know, that Christianity is on top, and Christianity is truth and reality, and that all of this is like part of the primitive, you know, superstition. And I think it's good for everybody, Christians, Jews, everybody, to like say, about that, you know,
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, I totally agree. And what's very interesting when we talk about systems of communication and extreme creativity and ingenuity. So it's not like that these spiritual practices were dropped. If you just Google some contributions and knowledges and skills, you will see even words in the American lexicon that have their root in traditional in African languages, right? The other part of it is there was a lot of times that these practices had to be passed on, and either they hid them within Christianity or birthed a whole nother tradition based on what they remembered and how they could reframe it. So you see that with practices like Santeria, you see it with Lakuni, you see it with Haitian Voodoo, you know, that's actually a spiritual practice. Of course, Hollywood, to Andrew's point, you know, made it like, oh, it's so scary, creepy. And, you know, as a student, as a reverend with my master's in theology and a student and practitioner of African traditional systems, it is just like Katthe talked about with the Dogon. Like your science is now catching up. Science is now catching up to what is happening, what looks to be like something that's very simple, but it is extreme spiritual technology happening behind it. And you don't know it, right? Because things are passed ear to mouth. It's not a thing where it's written down. And a lot of that, especially here, was done intentionally. And even done intentionally on the continent. So I think I'm so glad you brought that up, Katthe. I think that was a great point. Next slide.
I was talking about syncretism, which is paganism is different, but syncretism is syncretic is when two different traditions merge. And Cuba is a great place to go to see that, you know, Afro-Cuban tradition, because everybody was converted when they got to Cuba from Africa. And they overlaid the saints that were in the Catholic churches with the deities that were in their traditional religion. So it was people are blue, the Virgin Mary, that's Yemaya, who is the goddess of the ocean, so that's an example of syncretism and the way that things get overlaid.
Yep. And then you have some other traditions too, like happen in Cuba, right? And that Santeria comes from the Yoruba tradition. Then you have a tradition called Palo that comes from the Congo. I mean, you even see how many different people and systems are actually within, the merging of these different religions and traditions.
Yeah.
So now we wanted to bring it home and present. As Katthe said, we always like to come up to the present. This is our immediate past and our right now present, right? The crack epidemic versus the opioid epidemic. The war on drugs, right? Everybody I was born in 1977, I remember the brain on drugs, the frying of the egg commercial that they played way too much. And how the crack epidemic was presented, right? It was presented as something to be feared. It was presented as those people, right, who were criminals, people who were addicted to crack cocaine, weren't treated as needing to recover from addiction. They were treated as criminals. It was also depicted as this low-income minority, which I really hate that word, but just to drive the point home, low-income minority problem. And that is even untrue. There were plenty of, because of the way the crack epidemic spread, there were plenty of African Americans who were in middle class and upper middle class families who had people who were addicted to crack. You also had the whole drug dealing subculture that emerged out of crack. Not that they say it wasn't drug dealers before, but this became a whole different situation, which even influenced what we talked about, those who remember the whole hip hop and resilience conversation when you look at the history of hip hop. Right, the media created this moral panic, and it demonized black and brown people. But on the other side, like now,
wait, because the other thing that happened back then was that the money got put into police and policing.
Yes.
And militarizing the police and building and improving prisons. That was the solution, because the problem was lawlessness and criminality. And by the way, even back then, it was a cocaine problem writ large. So, but more white people were doing cocaine and more people of color were doing crack. Crack is cocaine, but it's a cheaper, more potent form of cocaine. But the white cocaine addicts, again, were not demonized the way the crack addicts were,
And all these years later, the 80s, 90s, 2010s, the 2000s, last thing, the longer and severe sentencing policies, right, between crack and crack cocaine, not just for those addicted.
Simone says cocaine was for the rich folks, right? But the cocaine addicts were not given. Our point is that they weren't given the same stigma. Like cocaine was almost glorified. Like if you watch, what is that one with Leonardo DiCaprio?
Blow. Is it Blow?
No, Wall Street. He's like.
Oh, The Wolf of Wall Street.
I don't know if that's the one, but he's portrayed. He's a cocaine addict, and it was like all these clubs in New York City. It was very cool to be a cocaine addict, but crack addicts were, these bad people. But it's kind of not different,
And there were crack addicts of all races.
Right.
Right. I know a few still.
Yeah.
So of all races. And so that didn't happen. Then when you get now to this opioid epidemic is a public health emergency, right? There's all of this, they're struggling. We talked about that. And then the very interesting one is the victims of big pharma and corporate greed. You have the lawsuits that are happening. Where was the lawsuit in the American government's role, right, with the Iran-Contra scan, the Iran-Contra, all of that America, FBI, and CIA, and there's a really great documentary on Netflix now that kind of goes, and then there's a few other ones, America's role in making this crack epidemic. But now you have, people suing Big Pharma about, you have doctors who participated in prescribing this. You have the now it's focused on treatment, drug courts. Let's just say drug courts. are focused on treatment and diversion. The first drug court was in 1989. It was started in 1989 in response to the crack epidemic, and their focus was on incarceration. Within the last 10 years or so, now their focus is on treatment and diversion. I've actually did parenting classes in drug courts, and most of the time you have the white partners, and I call the people who were in the program partners, that were there. They were all addicted to opioids or meth. And then you had African Americans who were there, and they were either addicted to crack cocaine, or they were just maybe had something with them and then just, okay, let me use this diversion. I'm just, being honest, right? And so then the media's moral panic was, we need to be empathetic and compassionate, and they are struggling, and we need all of these programs. And so now the local and national governments, the budgets are on educating who? The masses of people to understand recovery. Shameless plug, Be Strong Families has a recovery cafe that uses our Vitality domains to help people who are in recovery and the families. But that wasn't the concept of recovery versus rehabilitation, which I love that much better. Nobody said that when it was the crack epidemic. And so there's these mental health programs and then the drug court diversion.
And we're not saying that, I don't think we're saying that we want anything to be treated the way the crack epidemic was treated. I mean, I think, you can have a different point. The idea is consistency, right? So if you're going to treat this one way, understand that racism is part of that. I mean, wouldn't it have been better to treat the crack epidemic the way we did the opioid epidemic? Why wasn't that a public health emergency? Why weren't people focused on how crack got into neighborhoods? Like that's the thing, is now we're looking at, well, how did this happen with the opioids? Well, big pharma and corporate greed and the doctors who are overprescribing, like they are part of, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. But when we looked at the crack epidemic, we didn't even ask the question, or the question wasn't part of the public discourse of how did this get this way, because it fed into pre-existing stereotypes. Once you say, well, decide that it's not that everybody is a crack, there are crack addicts in every population, but it's mostly Black and brown people, then you can feed into the stereotypes of what has to be done.
And actually, the problems that it caused with families who were trying to help their crack addicted family members, also the longer and severe sentencing practices, they're still trying, especially in Virginia, trying to get people, released from prison who were a part of these unfair. And it wasn't just around if you were addicted, but it was also the distribution. The top level cocaine dealers got way less time than the drug dealers who were selling crack cocaine.
Wow.
And so we're still reaming from that. And the thing you said about would have been treated the same, we can't even go back and begin to recover. We can only start from now and try to fix it, all of the things that happened. So yeah.
We only have 3 minutes, Alexandra. We're going to have to finish this anyway, whether people can hang out that long or not. But Tammy says mental health in general was looked at differently back then. And Morgan says Kill the Messenger movie on Netflix also touches on this.
Thank you, Ramon. Next slide, please. And we're moving towards the end really quickly. We just talked about, if we reframe and we have this positive lens and this intention, we can learn from the past, build a better future. We have rigorous truth versus the whitewashing and romanticizing, cross-cultural education and sharing, diversity, equity, inclusion as a societal value, and history versus propaganda.
And what we mean by this is when we are going to write history, when we are going to do historiography, how do we write a story that's true and accurate? How do we include multiple points of view? How do we get over our own, biases, or at least, make them clear what our biases are? And that's where the whitewashing and romanticizing versus rigorous truth, that we need to really, take responsibility.
Yes, definitely. And there is hope. Next slide, really quickly. Why does it matter? We're not going to get to answer these questions. What difference does it make? I think we have answered, but I do want people again to think about what difference does it make for providers who work with African American families. Great quote from the founder of the Children's Defense Fund. Next slide.
No, wait, don't.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah, like I want to go, even if people need to get off, this is going to be YouTubeable. So I think it's important to say, what difference does it make for providers who work with African American families? Why does any provider who works with African American families need to be conscious of this history, of this? Why is that important? May says, learn and build. Yes, that's true. I think it's also just that it's part of understanding where the people who you're working with are coming from, because many African American families have quite a sophisticated view of, and a nuanced view of the history and what has been done to them, you know. And if you come into it and you don't know that, you know, as a white person, and you are working with African American people and you don't know what's going on, you're not going to be able to connect in the way that you would be able to connect if you did know, right?
Definitely. I totally agree. And it would, and knowing Black history and really knowing it helps keep those biases in check. Well, because those would get dismantled, and biases and stereotypes and perceptions.
And the other thing it does, based on what you've been saying also, Alexandra, in terms of your opportunity to be able to assist people with, you know, with surfacing and disrupting internalized racism. So if you really understand, if you really in your heart of hearts and in your guts understand that the people who are here, that whose ancestors went through the Middle Passage, are the strongest of the strong, are the resilient, come from kings and queens, you know, the progeny of kings and queens, then you have an opportunity to assist others with improving their self-esteem, you know?
Exactly, especially children and youth. Tamara, thank you for that resource. Next slide. So reframing history, Katthe and I aren't just the only ones. There's this great book out, African American Latinx history, and a lot of this is happening. Even like the people's history is another reframing, those volumes in those different editions. But this is the quote from Paul Ortiz, where he said while he wrote the book, he wanted to ensure that Latinx and Black children never had to be ashamed of who they are or where they come from, and they have nothing to apologize. And every democratic right we enjoy is an achievement for our ancestors, how we fought, suffered, and died. And I think that just perfectly aligned with what Katthe said in the previous slide. Next slide. We launched a poll.
So yeah, let's launch the poll and just join us next week. We have a whole lot of hopefully inspiring, hopefully educational, hopefully, you know, illuminating, hopefully vitalizing topics. And then next slide, please. What do you want to amplify coming out of today's webinar? Hashtag amplify Black history. Hashtag amplify. What do you want to amplify, Alexandra?
Hashtag we are resilient.
Hashtag amplify reframing the narrative.
Yes.
Tell the story. And then the next slide, please. We say, remember to wear your mask. And we have masks and they're beautiful and comfortable. So hashtag all in this together. We're getting a lot of thanks in the webinar, in the chat. That's nice. And then if you have next slide, Selena, if you have a webinar that you would like to host, just contact me. This is by the community for the community. And I want to thank you all for coming on this Friday, and thank Alexandra for collaborating and sharing, being willing, because I know it's not easy.
Definitely. And thank you all for coming and being here and sharing this space with us and sharing this information with us. And we will see you next week.
Yeah, and share it with others too. Feel free to, it'll be up on our website. It'll be on our YouTube channel. And we would encourage you sharing. If you think it was important, then share. Hi, Zalika. Aloha. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.